here today. This is the third LLC talk, and the title is "What is the Afactual? Humanities in the Age of Fake News?" And Alex Paul Smith and Claire is going to give us the talk today. Thank you very much, Alex. Alex received his BAs in International Studies and German Studies and the MA in German Studies at the University of Arizona. His doctoral work was at the Ohio State University in Germanic Language and Literatures, and he has since taught at the University of Notre Dame, Baylor University, and in the Middlebury Summer Language Schools. He has just completed a major translation of Professor Christoph Möllers' book, The Possibility of Norms, which will appear with Oxford University Press. And he's wrapping up his second year here at UNH. Next year, he will be co-organizing the CIDOR lecture series on mass incarceration in the U.S. together
New Hampshire and the U.S.
Okay, together with the honors program. Please welcome him.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time in your day. I know it's always tough, and that 3 to 4 o'clock zone, I always like a nap right around now, so mad respect for showing up. So I've structured this into 2 simple parts because it is my first talk at UNH. I want to give a little bit of a background on where I'm coming from, research-wise. But the core of the talk is the second part. That should be like a good 20 minutes of just talking about this word, the afactual. Some of y'all are in my 525 class. We talked a little bit about what that is. So it's not a very complex, typical academic talk. It's a pretty broad proposal that I have. I think the word afactual can help us figure out our public discourse mess a little better. And I'll be interested to see what kind of questions you have in response to that. But I want to just, since it is my first talk at UNH, I'll give a little brief background on where I'm coming from. As you've heard already, I got my undergrad, my BAs and MAs at Arizona. And I had no inkling of where I would go after undergrad. I was just a pretty ignorant first-generation kid. And one of the first things that sparked my interest was just this special assignment I had in a German class, looking into a rare book in our special collections library on a German Jesuit, or by a German Jesuit priest missionary in Baja, California. That was just fascinating, and I learned how to sit for hours and just dig into a book for the first time in earnest. So that sparked some interest. In undergrad, I did poli-sci, econ, and philosophy, and early on was just very interested in social theory, critical theory, but always had this inkling that the critical was a little too strong. There was nothing constructive in critical theory, or in deconstruction for that matter. So that's kind of been a thread throughout grad school and in my early career. There were 2 books that stood out early on in grad school for me, and one is Jürgen Habermas' Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which I really wrestled with initially in grad school to get into Habermas' language. But once you do get in, he's a quite clear writer. And then around that time, I think it was 2005, or relatively clear writer, agree to disagree. There was this really interesting small volume called The Dialectics of Secularization that came out. It was an exchange between Habermas, a fairly leftist German academic, a secular academic, and then Joseph Ratzinger, who then became Pope Benedict XVI. And that kind of set the tone for a lot of my interest. I was fascinated by how they embodied dialogue across really significant differences, a very religious viewpoint to a very secular viewpoint. So those were just some early steps in thinking about going to grad school. Then I moved to beautiful Columbus, Ohio with the permacloud, and we had, in the first 2 years there, we had a reading group on the public sphere, and that further familiarized helped me to further familiarize myself with Habermas' work more. Had a wonderful fellowship year in Berlin where I got to meet Habermas and do a workshop on his whole corpus of work. And I also started to work on, in connection with Habermas, do a lot of reading of Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher who has written a lot about secularism in the last decade or so. And this all culminated in the wonderful dissertation title, Philosophie und Literatur im postsäkularen Zeitalter, so Philosophy and Literature in the Post-Secular Age, religiöse Gewalt im zeitgenössischen Roman, Religious Violence in the Contemporary Novel. Smooth title. And I think at the end of the day, the dissertation itself was just as smooth as its title. I don't think I ultimately accomplished like bridging the gap between the literary and the theory. I've been able to make some individual like article projects from that, but I've not published that as a monograph, and I don't think I will, to be quite honest. I went in different directions now. Yeah, the idea in the dissertation was looking at how these extreme measures of terrorists are articulated in fictional settings. Why do these protagonists resort to extreme means for what I thought was this underlying existential inarticulacy? That comes, the word articulacy or inarticulacy comes from Charles Taylor's thought. I could talk a lot about that, I'd love to, but that's a little tangential to today's talk. Then after grad school, I was at Notre Dame and Baylor for 2 years each, and I just really honed in on Taylor's notion of articulacy or inarticulacy. That took me to recognition theory, which looks even more fundamentally at kind of this anthropological need for recognition and how that feeds into social and political battles. Another tangent I won't go down. But more fundamentally, what I've kind of what's really stuck with me is this focus on critical theory and philosophy of language. Again, getting back to this idea of agreement across really significant ideological differences. How does it happen in language? How does it happen in argumentation? So that's been the focus since then. Since getting here, a year and a half plus ago, I've continued the articulacy line, published a few book reviews on aesthetics, hermeneutics, money, and theology, and I think I got the wrong PhD. I should have done German literature. I should have just done straight philosophy, right? But they go together pretty well. 2 days ago, I got the wonderful news that I got an article accepted in the Kleist yearbook. This thing was a long, arduous piece of work that initially got like the revise and resubmit, then got rejected, but now it's been accepted by the Kleist yearbook, and I was jumping for joy in my office. The biggest single chunk of work, though, has been this. This is I translated this book over the last year. I'll pass it around. It's already pretty beat up after a couple readings. And that's where this will transition into the idea of the Afactual. So this is a book by German legal philosopher Christoph Möllers. He teaches at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And it's called, ambitiously, The Possibility of Norms. So what he does is he really tries to describe what all social norms have in common. Be it something as complicated and meaningful as a constitution, be it table manners, be it traffic laws. He tries to find the commonality among all social norms and describe that in this book. And we'll get into him in a little more detail. So that was the all too brief condensation of grad school and the first couple of years since grad school. So maybe one more word on the Möllers book. So why it was of interest. So I think norms in particular are the things that are so contentious in public discourse. These are the things that we argue about most passionately, and that book helped me to kind of just conceptualize what are social norms and how can agreement be established, be fostered. So in what follows, so when getting into the Afactual, the core of the talk, I'll start up here actually, not at the beginning. I'll start with this very, very brief definition of the Afactual as Möllers uses it in his book. Then reflect on what I think are some fairly obvious challenges in public discourse in general. And by public discourse, I really intentionally mean public discourse as a whole, not academic public discourse. I think they're more pronounced in general public discourse. Then I want to look at more narrowly at the specific meaning of Afactual that Möllers uses, and then I want to try and provide a kind of visualization of this Afactual realm. And then I'll see if y'all buy it or not. So a super brief definition. It's not used often, the word Afactual. Google only yields 7,000 plus English results. And then the German form, Afactisch, even less, there's only 46. That was a couple days ago, maybe there's a few more since a couple days ago. And from what I can tell, especially in English, it's mostly used synonymously with counterfactual or fake. Right? As Möllers uses it, though, it's simply the afactual defines those phenomena that are neither factual nor counterfactual. And I think this takes up a huge realm of our knowledge in general, and we'll get to a visualization of that. So just taking a step back and looking at public discourse in general. I think what public discourse is generally suffering from are simplistic binaries, where any kind of knowledge, piece of information out there on the web or in books, in print, in conversation is either cast as factual, like feed me the facts, we've got fact checkers because we always have to check every single speech that's made, or fictitious, and it's dismissed as meaningless, right? Fake news, alternative facts become a little too common in our parlance. Or it's cast as objective analysis versus mere subjective opinion. And I feel like in most public discourse, this is just cast as either or. There's not much said about the middle ground. I think the afactual really describes that middle ground, which requires more rigorous intellectual work than some scientific inquiry. I think it leads to two tendencies. There's naively optimistic views, and I think a naively pessimistic view too. In the naively optimistic view, you'll see this idea that more science equals better public policy. Here's some signs from the March for Science. You got without science, it's just fiction, implying that fiction means nothing or very, very little. I think most literary scholars would take serious issue with that. Amen. Or asking not for prayers, but a government that believes in science. I actually don't think the government doesn't believe science, the current regime, but they're certainly very selective in how they narrate scientific facts and policy proposals. The other naivete, I think we all suffered from, or maybe most of us suffered from this in about 2011 with the Arab Spring. We thought more data is a better informed public. And we thought, oh, Facebook's going to democratize knowledge. People will be able to organize better and gather in the public square. And this is another thing from the March for Science. This was posted a few months ago, which initially I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of cute. Reading can seriously damage your ignorance, but only reading well, takes issue with your ignorance. Just reading, I think, has really been confirmed, especially if you think of the New Zealand shooter. He probably read a lot, right? But it was just stuff that reaffirmed his insane worldview. So reading alone doesn't do it. Reading well, I think that's a huge distinction to keep in mind. The naively pessimistic view is just skepticism, right? And I think this is always embodied by good old Ron Burgundy, who agrees to disagree that San Diego means Saint Diego. And sadly, I think this is really quite representative of a lot of public discourse. We do agree to disagree. You're entitled to your opinion, I'm entitled to mine. And what's implied in that is that any kind of mere opinion is equally valid. Right? I think that's a tremendous problem. I think deconstruction in a superficial sense is also problematic. I think we're tempted to dismiss certain norms, certain morals, certain values, often simply because they're constructs. There's certainly a lot of, all norms are social constructs, but I think there's a knee-jerk kind of tendency in public discourse to dismiss some values, norms, as simply because they're dismissed as constructs. Just a brief slide on fake news. I think fake news itself is a pretty simple phenomenon, kind of distinguish. I think there's a distinction between obviously actual fake news, actually counterfactual news, lies, something like Pizzagate, or most stuff that was propagated on InfoWars and Mr. Alex Jones. But then there's what I think is mislabeled fake news, which dismisses unfavorable analysis as false, right? Even though you would have to actually contend with the position taken, argue and bring up reasons, it's just dismissed. And like I write in the second point, it's kind of like an ad hominem rejection for argument, right? Instead of dismissing the person and kind of attacking the person, we just dismiss our argument as fake news, and that kind of delegitimizes it wholesale. I think what that does is it overlooks the really complex afactual character of a lot of analysis, and this requires a lot more rigorous engagement. This, I mean, as clear as I think that distinction is, I think it's being very blurred right now, right? It's blurred in public discourse with people settling simply for power politics, right? Insisting on their opinion because they're entitled to their opinion, and if there's no point in trying to come to agreement because all opinions are equally valid, then it boils down to just power politics, right? And we see that a lot. There's no more hope in trying to negotiate a notion of a common good. That's just been completely dismissed with, even by those that traditionally defended it. So I think the danger is in blurring that fairly obvious distinction. Here's the attempt, I want to get into the narrower context of afactual first. I was trying to visualize afactual. So I want to go back to Professor Möllers for a second, because it's in his book that I came across the term the first time, and he really only invokes it once, and he defines it as neither factual nor counterfactual, like I said earlier. But I want to give a little more of the context. So again, he's describing and trying to identify what all social norms share in common. And in describing that normativity, I apologize for the one lengthier quote. We'll read through this a little more slowly. The assumption is early on in the book where he defines what he thinks normativity means. The assumption for which I will argue in the following is to understand norms, social norms, as positively marked possibilities. Norms point towards a possible state or a possible event. To posit something impossible as the object of a norm is pointless. The positive marking of a possibility, this affirmation of a possibility, indicates that it should be realized. There's some ethical imperative there. The supposition is that one can only speak of normativity where it is presumed that the world could be different than it currently is. It's always about envisioning a world different than it currently is, this possibility down the road. Normativity hinges on the possibility of a divergent constitution of the world or a judgment of the world, the measure of which is not limited to the world as it is. He, early in the book, he goes back to early Christianity and uses that as a kind of main example of where normative thinking had a tremendous step forward. Right? It was really about envisioning a different world, sometimes in the world now, sometimes in a world beyond our existence. But it was about really critiquing the status quo and envisioning a differently possible world. He doesn't get into a theological or debate or a religious apology, but that's a good example that he uses. Further along in the book, he's in describing norms. He's really careful to distinguish two parts of any norm. There's a factual side and an afactual side. So he says, imagine a society in which some social norm is adhered to completely. Say a smaller society that requires a certain tattooing at a certain age as a rite of initiation. And everyone in that society abides by it. There's a factual element. You can quantify the adherence to that norm, so you could see it as a mere social fact. But he says there's still something normative in that social norm, and that is afactual. This is where he distinguishes between what's factual and what's afactual. There's still something ethical that you cannot quantify that compels people to actually abide by that. I have to put that part up. So here's the grand attempt to try and visualize this a little bit. If we think of this big blue pie as our knowledge pie, then I think the actual strictly factual knowledge is quite limited. It's a really rigorous or reliable epistemic sphere. It relies on falsifiable and verifiable data. And it's rigid, but I think it's a smaller slice of the pie than we often imagine. And here I'm including just showing a couple phenomena that I think would qualify as afactual phenomena. Values, which are also just specific kinds of norms. Law itself, I think, is afactual. Of course, so I've got this transition zone here, the green and blue. I think all of these phenomena straddle, just like Möllers describes in the book. On the one hand, you can factually describe them as they exist, but there's still a constitutive element of all of these things that is afactual and you simply cannot quantify. Manners, aesthetics, I think language itself as art is ultimately afactual. That's just describing that transitory zone. They all straddle this factual and afactual. On the one hand, you can observe it, quantify it, but there's still something at work in them, in the norms in these systems, that is afactual. Then within that afactual realm, I think you do have mere opinion, which can have all kinds of different levels of distinction. But the intellectual operation that we do here is hermeneutics, right? And that is what that actually is prior to the scientific method, is kind of interpretive skills and categorizing. So understanding of facts and social phenomena relies on hermeneutics itself an evaluative afactual process. Not to be able to make sense of the scientific method, you have to have an outside understanding of afactual theories. So how does it help? I'll leave it with these 3 points as why I think this helps in trying to clarify things in public discourse a little bit. It's not addressing a new problem. There's been a long debate about the fact-value dichotomy. It started by Hume, who argued for keeping these realms of knowledge very distinct and separate. But it reframes it with a new term because I think the afactual captures more than just values. And I think it helps complicate our epistemic picture. Right? What I've said is kind of this simplified binary of things being either factual or counterfactual. This helps break down that dichotomy and just bring back an awareness that the afactual realm requires much more rigorous intellectual engagement. I think too often in public discourse, it's simply dismissed. Right? It's decried as fake news if I don't like it, and it's simply dismissed in that way. And yeah, the last point kind of reiterates that I think it gives credence to many phenomena that are just lazily mislabeled as fake news. So we flew through a lot of the Möllers stuff and that kind of pie chart that I threw up there. I'm open for questions to see if this seems as intuitive to you as it does to me, and yeah, we can revisit some of the details from a long way. I want to maybe ask students first, because that's like a Notre Dame tradition. Students first, then faculty. Go back to other slides, things that didn't make any sense.
I'm neither faculty nor a
Okay,
student,
go for
it. So I'll ask the most basic question I can think of, and then later I've got something I want to argue with you about. But what in the world is hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics, I think you could simplify it as interpretation, right? Evaluation. Yeah. What's that?
Where it's always within a context.
Yeah. Like a rigorous examination of a context of a given phenomenon. Bill.
I guess I'm a little bit, when I associate fact and truth. The costing of fact is to say that there's a true sentence that describes it. So when you talk about the afactual, I get a little bit worried that maybe if norms are afactual, there are no truths about them. And it seems to me that, for instance, it is true that murder is wrong.
I think I have a different, I guess my understanding of facts would be more strictly in kind of like a natural science sense. Whereas the afactual, part of what the case I want to make is that the afactual does contain truth, but that we all too lazily dismiss it as not containing truth.
Mm. So it's not a fact that I'm holding my iPad here?
I put that, yes it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Kate and Ed?
I think going to this point about what's true and what's untrue, there's Stuart Hall actually has a lot of useful things to say about this in relation to discourse. He says that his students often get to some point where they're starting to understand what he's talking about, and they're like, okay, discourse is where meaning happens, discourse is how we start to understand each other. And they get to this point and they say, wait a minute, are you saying that there's nothing real in the world? That reality doesn't exist outside of discourse? And Stuart Hall has a really neat way, I think, of addressing that problem. And he says that it's not that reality doesn't exist outside of discourse. It's that the moment humans engage with any piece of reality, it only becomes meaningful within the realm of discourse. So that's that sort of realm of association that you need to take into account, which I think really goes well to what you're talking about with the afactual, but doesn't necessarily deny that there is reality outside. But the reason I think what you're talking about, for me at least, is so powerful is a lot of the work that I'm looking at is looking at white supremacist discourse in the public sphere. And I think so often white supremacists claim this factual ground, and their antagonists often engage with them on that same factual territory and fail over and over and over, because they deliver the factual counter arguments, which we would agree are based on better empirical foundations or any empirical foundations, but it doesn't really matter, right? Because they keep running into, they're playing the same rules as white supremacists, and they fail, because they're not engaging with the afactual kinds of conditions around it, which is part of why I think what you're talking about is really powerful and has great relevance for really important things that we're talking about.
Does Hall distinguish between, does meaning constitute truth? Or does he distinguish between the two?
No, meaning is, so like meaning becomes, somebody else can jump in, because I feel like there's a lot of people who responded to that, probably have more to add. But he's sort of not, he's not concerned necessarily with the question between truth and untruth, right? Meaning is a sort of different realm, which, like you said, involves parts of truth, but often a selective piecing together of certain truths, right? And so he says our job is to understand where those pieces of truth are being brought together, what strategically is being brought together in those pieces of truth, what might be missing, what our limitations of our frameworks are that prevent us from seeing beyond that, and so on.
And Nina, Manny, Reggie, Tom.
So can you go back to the slide that has the chart?
Yep.
Love charts. Okay, so I'm kind of in the same line, but kind of a follow-up to Bill's question. So, sorry, us philosophers have to represent. So you say when you're thinking of factual matters, you're thinking of it in just like simply a natural sciencey kind of way. But that's like a super bold metaphysical claim, right? So I'm thinking about a lot of mainstream ethical theories, in particular like utilitarianism, but also forms of Kantianism, right? And what a good utilitarian is going to tell us is that, we just have this obligation to maximize utility. That's probably a natural fact about the world. There are a lot of realists about what's good. Those people all become consequentialists. And they're going to tell you that when it comes down to laws and norms and aesthetics and values, it's just going to turn out that all and only those things are good, which maximize utility. And it's up to us to discover how it is that utility is maximized. But that's where the underlying truth of the matter is going to be. So I'm wondering if you're thinking at all about the metaphysical assumptions that you're making and whether you think that they might be problematic, or at least super bold.
I mean, I think I'm narrowing the definition of facts quite specifically because I think it helps to flesh out the afactual. I haven't thought about the metaphysical. I don't want to defend utilitarianism anyway. Yeah, I'll let that slow simmer a while. Manny.
Doesn't all this go back to the original question, which is murder is wrong a truth or a fact? And I think, just from the legal perspective, which is the one I got at the moment, they're completely different. The facts are somebody's dead, And what we try to do at trials is figure out who is the person who factually killed her. That has nothing to, and that's just the assumption there is, as you're saying, that murder is wrong. That's not a fact. That's something
Right.
we've created. That's
Right.
something we've gone through. That's a truth. And I think
It's certainly not a
that's
fact.
your distinction.
Right, it brings up the distinction between truth and fact. That's certainly not a fact. If you want to have a broader definition of what's factual, you could count social norms as facts. But again, they are contingent. They're made by us, right? There is no law in nature that says not to kill people, right? That's maybe the opposite. Or do you think so?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating because it continues in my mind, what you're asking us to consider, to underscore the importance of language, right? And how we think what we know is, right? And so for me, something like a factual assumption, right, is denuding, right, the ideologies that we live in through language, right? And so to quote or to think about another Stuart Hall text, signifying off of Kate's contribution, right? How language, we know that language in and of itself is an ideology. At best, language is a metaphorical sign system that attempts to name knowledge that a group of individuals come together and agree. Like, that chair is only a chair that everyone is sitting on because someone back in time had the power to name it as such, not because it is in and of itself. And we've all agreed since then that that is a chair. But in reality, it could have been called couch, right? It could have been called Toyota.
Yes.
Right? But we agree upon these meanings, and so even as I'm thinking about fact and truth, well, these are, again, in my mind, metaphorical signifiers of a human's attempt to name and order experience. But those things are no more true than the validity we give to them. Because language is in and of itself an ideology. Who had the power to call that chair and make it stick?
Yeah, the contingency of language figures huge in this. And when I was reading and translating Möllers, I kept thinking, would language itself qualify as a social norm in his sense? I don't think it's quite the same as a social norm, but it certainly is guided by social norms. Yeah. I always think back to a student years ago asking, well, why does Baum mean tree? Like, why does tree mean tree? It's a ridiculous question if you think about it, but I get it, in that moment.
So assuming the afactual is the water in the stream that is narrative.
Okay.
Nice little metaphor. Does that ever pass through what we consider the factual knowledge, or is all narrative completely something afactual that maybe is dependent on factual, but is never a part of factual?
I think it weaves the factual in. Of course, they're not separate, right? I do think they're part of the same pie, right? The factual certainly feeds into our, if we're thinking about policy, right? Policy is this afactual phenomenon that's guided by morals, ethics, and ideally, we do build off of scientific knowledge and data, right? It certainly feeds into that afactual, but narrative itself is certainly afactual because the language itself is afactual, contingent.
So then again, that asks, does narrative weave through factual, or is narrative only something that's created from material stretching out from factual knowledge?
I'd say it develops the factual. And the factual itself is no more objective because it relies on words, right, on narrative. Yeah. Donna? Michelle?
I'm going to break a little bit this fascinating conversation because my question is motivated by pedagogical interest. So you're teaching this in 525, and in my opinion, it's no wonder because it reminds me closely of the theory of the cultural iceberg, right? With cultural iceberg, what you see, the facts, right? But the culture is not made only by the facts. It's also made by what you don't see, which is, submerged, yes. and the part that is submerged under the water is also made of different layers. And I can definitely see the layers. And I'm using the cultural iceberg theory in my 525.
Yeah.
So to see that replicate into a different way. So my question is, is there a follow-up on this theory in your class? How do you get from this to culture?
In 525, who else is it from 525? Gwyn, yeah.
Can you give us the title of the course?
What's that? It's the discovery course in the program, and this year it's the German troublemakers from 1500 to 2000, or to now. Till Eulenspiegel, Martin Luther, all the way through Antifa. And we discussed, I have a short essay in which I discussed the Afactual. I actually had not an op-ed, like a letter to the editor of Science magazine, or no, Nature, and about this. I said the March for Science is ignoring the Afactual and the Humanities. So we discussed that explicitly at the beginning of the semester, framing the class, but haven't followed up since then, right, at the end of class, I hope. Yeah.
Because it's absolutely fascinating. The factual knowledge is what we see and we consider culture, right? The way we dress, the way we, the food we eat, but how did we get to eat that food? Why do we eat it that way? What are the norms behind that act, right? And the norms are hidden. They're not necessarily up in your face. So in order for us to get to what constitutes the culture of a people means to get to the deeper layers, and that's something very difficult to do. And obviously, in one semester, you can't pretend that you're going to teach somebody the culture of the people. But at least we're trying. So that's absolutely fascinating, because this Afactual is in fact something that exists, but it's not obvious. And because it's not obvious, we have to have a discourse about what it is. And in a way, we build it, right? The Afactual is something that we build. And it's
And I think it's like the implicit thread in the class, because we're looking at troublemakers, we're asking what norms are they rubbing up against at that historical time, and what new norms are they proposing. I hope it's kind of...
Speaking as a sociologist, I'm not sure what the Afactual adds. And why can't we just talk about it as an ethical compulsion, perhaps? So there's social norms that exist as empirically fact, right? What people do, trends. But then there's really the ethical piece. Why do they do what they do? I mean, Durkheim would say they do what they do because of the social imposition of life in community, regardless even of any ethical deep digging. Weber obviously take a different view. And I'm glad I'm not in your class. It sounds like complicated, but what's being advanced by this concept? And you mentioned Habermas, so why not talk about between facts into norms and values?
Well, for me, the Afactual actually helps to clarify the difference between the social sciences and the humanities. To me, the social sciences deal largely with that factual side of these social phenomena. Right?
But we do it always in the context of understanding. So in the Weberian tradition, we're always within the hermeneutic circle of the culture which we're trying to understand, and that's why I also love Stuart Hall, because he recognizes that culture is always emerging. There's histories, I should say. There's multiple ways of having lived history, experienced history, but there's also multiple ways of becoming collectively. So there's a dynamism there.
Yeah, I think social sciences kind of straddles so I would say social sciences tend to focus on the phenomena itself and its facticity. It certainly drifts into meaning as well. I think.
Well, I would beg to differ. Maybe psychology, if they are often are stuck already at the positive. Sociology, I would say we're always looking at meaning. That's why we have social theory, because we look at meaning. It's not just survey data that X% do X. It's trying to make sense. Why did they do it, and how did they get to this point? And anyway,
I would have said that humanities has more of an emphasis on the meaning.
But not on the facts, right? That's but they ignore the facts to some extent.
I hope not.
Closer to the circle.
I hope there'd be like a weighting, of the two realms.
Well, this actually was kind of where I was going as well, except without the sociology versus psychology element. But kind of looking at this knowledge pie, as you call it, and thinking of where, you know, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities map onto that. Do humanities enter at all into that strictly green zone, or are we only outside the green zone?
No, the humanities can encompass, I mean, again, you know, there's a philosophy of science, but not a science of philosophy, or not a natural science of philosophy. Although, I guess you could, that would be an
Argue
interesting discussion.
linguistics. You could argue that linguistics is that bridge between factual knowledge and
Yes, you could. Yes, you could.
but all the EEGs and cognitive studies at the same time as using social data.
Well, you can do a natural science about what goes on in a philosopher's discussion, but that's not doing philosophy.
And it won't ever lead to prediction of what's coming next, right? It won't lead to any theorems about philosophy, right? You can't predict philosophy. Ed kept overlooking that.
I think that what you need to do is put that image into motion. Because you know, when I look at this, I see that is where the factual, that's where the Wissenschaft is, right? But that Wissenschaft is certainly an expanding and contracting, and it interacts with other parts. So if there's a way for you to generate some motion in that image, you might please a lot of people here.
Right. Well, it also brings up the German, you know, Wissenschaft.
Well, yeah, that was
which gets back to your question.
Yeah.
I mean, the Germans do distinguish between Geistes and Sozialwissenschaften, so the sciences of the mind and spirit and social, but arguably you could continue, you would still include the Sozialwissenschaften under Geisteswissenschaften, you know, and do we need to distinguish like we do in English? Tell me.
Just a question, how would you translate that into the political? Does the factual help us in the political realm? And supplementary question, where would you put in this washing machine of knowledge? Where do you put figures like Agamben's bare life?
I'm unfamiliar with that from Agamben, but
the idea of those human beings that are in the threshold of humanity or liminal positions like citizens without a state, like because I'm more interested in the political, unfortunately, than I am in other areas, and I'm interested in your talk, but I would like to see the translation.
I mean, hopefully the factual feeds into political decision making, but those are ultimately afactual, you know, moral decisions. As far as the liminal figure, I have to read up more on account. Okay?
No, because this afactual seems to be a kind of in-between position.
Yeah.
And the in-betweenness has been talked
Yeah.
about in many areas.
Yeah, it seems to fit that description for sure.
You seem to be wishing for a bridging.
Yeah.
In-betweenness.
But what's it bridging? I mean, it wouldn't bridge the factual and the counterfactual. I don't think it bridges that. Our knowledge pie should only consist of that and not the counterfactual.
But it could break the us versus them.
It could be. It could serve. I do hope it serves as a bridge builder in discourse. You know, between the kind of binary positions of dismissing afactual knowledge or you know, just wanting the facts. Right. This came up in like our first class, like in 525. We should only, you know, use facts when we're discussing. Yeah, we're in a humanities course. There's not many facts, except like historical facts, right? We're interpreting things, so.
Well, I'm asking because as you talk about troublemakers, I thought a lot of terrorism and humanities. So the idea, where do you put that figure and how do you avoid these humanities?
Bill, oh, the whole wave. We'll start writing it down again.
10 minutes here. My question is, I've seen a concept circulating a lot to grasp this problem also, and it's post-truth. I've been seeing that some theories have been proposing that to especially to understand the virtual world, right? Because the idea that truth is so multiple and is constructed by so many angles, that is something that it can be beyond our reach. So is there a relationship between the affactual and the post-truth, or?
Yeah, I've read about that a lot too. I think it was the word of the year in Germany 2 years ago, the post-factual and then post-truth.
Yes.
I like the afactual a lot more as a replacement for that idea, because the post, always implies this like temporal development and we're past it. No, I think we need to reclaim the afactual. Like the humanities need to be bolder instead of like being defensive and always complaining about the money that goes to STEM. We need to reclaim the afactual because it's the stuff that gives us meaning in life.
And the post is at some point negating the truth, right? It's assuming that it is not possible to get the truth.
I think truth is possible. We're not past truth. It's just that we're lazy.
I'm curious, for example, about the legal example, because in the legal realm, the legal truth is different to the actual truth. Exactly. I mean, ideally, it should coincide, right? But it's not possible at some point. That's why, for example, people who are sentenced for a crime 10 years later are discovered that they were not the murderers. So the legal scenario is exactly, it's a practice to get evidence as much as possible, but admitting that there are evidence that are beyond our control and are beyond the control of the trial, right? So
and those legal norms are, I think going back to Möllers' text, it's interesting because as a legal philosopher in Germany, you're really tied into the legal practice too. So he's still involved in kind of constitutional cases, and he clarifies that very limited temporal nature of laws, right? They can always be revised. All social norms are open to revision, right? We're never going to find a natural law of social norms, right? They are always temporary, however good they may be for a certain period of time. A student? Yeah. Owen, then Carmen, and then...
So, just with post-factual, I mean, I saw it most being used on like social media being like the primary, or like media in general, especially in 2016 with the election. But it was treated more like a mindset. I mean, especially with reference to Trump or the other administrators, it's this idea of there isn't a truth, or if there is, I'm going to shut my mind to it. So whether or not it's, post-truth, okay. So whereas fact, whether or not it is factually true, afactual, or factually counterfactual, thank you. I'm mixing up truth and fact here a little bit. But kind of not, I guess from my perspective, seeing it the way it's used in culture is more of this mindset, not necessarily a theory opposed to a factual. It would almost be over-encompassing that use of factual knowledge or afactual. But if you're post-truth, it doesn't matter if it's factual or afactual, you're ignoring it either way.
Yeah, and even it's been kind of interesting looking, deconstruction has long been like kind of located in the left side of academia, but it's becoming very popular on the alt-right side of things, right? Dismiss truth and the idea of truth, and then it's just power politics, right? Common ground does not matter anymore at all. Right? It's been really interesting to see Richard, what's his name? Punch-the-face guy, Spencer. Embrace kind of the post-truth idea and kind of deconstruction. They love referring back to Nietzsche occasionally, inserting a random quote, Carmen and Phillips.
Just imagine a Martian comes to the Earth. Yes, that is the Earth. And this Martian is observing the Earth. So I wonder to what point the affactual can become for a Martian, the affactual. Because observation and objectivation of the affactual can make it or transform it into something factual.
Yeah, as a Martian, or as extraterrestrials, if they have like a different cognition system, we would have to be observable data points. Yeah, I guess it would not apply to the person of another kind of intelligence.
So to what point the affactual is, for what you are explaining, is a kind of cultural artifact. Right? So it depends on what civilization are we talking about, or what type of culture. We have different values, different norms, different perspectives. So in some way, the Afactual can be considered to something factual from a cultural point of view.
Yeah. From a total outsider perspective, yeah, for sure. Yeah. But for us, I think it's a pragmatic, we can't get
I know,
outside of it because
that's
it's a
very
pragmatic
good.
operation
Yes.
of our minds. Yeah. You still have something?
Well, I want to put it across for the counterfactual. The way you've used that term is a little bit different from the lingo that shows up in philosophy. We often talk about counterfactual conditionals in particular, because it turns out that a lot of our, what you might even call factual knowledge, is what it is, and only has the meaning it has for us because it's involved with a lot of counterfactual knowledge. That is, knowledge about what would happen if, right? If I were to, drop my mug, it would fall.
Yeah.
Right? That's, a lot of people think that's, as it were, a scientific fact, but of course it's a counterfact. It's if I were to. And in fact, our factual knowledge is laced heavily with the counterfactual, because we only appreciate, as it were, the fact on the ground and understand its meaning insofar as we know how to fit it into a whole range of counterfactual suppositions about what might. You don't understand what is happening unless you understand it against the background of what might happen, or what would happen. How does that fit into that kind of picture?
I guess we look at the conditionals. I mean, experience and knowledge of other natural laws would still feed in. I would argue, just off the cuff, that they would fit into the interpretive framework, like the interpretive operation of considering those counterfactual facts. Or counterfactual, what's
counterfactual?
Non-fact?
I don't know. They're
counterfactual truths.
Mm-hmm.
I would say they
Nominalize it, counterfactuals.
Yeah.
There you go.
That they would figure in the hermeneutic process.
Okay.
Holly.
Can I go back further to the afactual, but the normativity? Because I was struck by
from
how,
Möllers?
yeah, I was struck by how different it felt in tone to normativity as it's discussed in queer theory.
Yeah.
And so the idea that something about an understanding of the world could be different than it possibly is, and it just sounds so like hopeful and lovely. But in queer theory, normativity is something that's like more of a straitjacket, more of a violence to difference and diversity and heterogeneity. So I was wondering.
Yeah, and so that's really interesting. We did a panel on this book at last year's German Studies conference, and one of the panelists, his expertise was queer studies. I can't pretend to be an expert, but his paper was fascinating because it confirmed some of the suspicions I had that within queer studies, and understand that often heteronormativity kind of bleeds into the understanding of normativity, whereas normativity in and of itself is quite neutral. I mean, we just cannot operate without normativity, right? So this is, in a sense, it's ethics, right? Normativity is ethics. It's always temporarily limited, and like Möllers always says, makes it very clear, it has to always be open to change, right? It never becomes a permanent rule. Like a certain social norm will never become permanent. And in this, my colleague's paper at the panel kind of affirmed that there were these misunderstandings and kind of short circuits of equating heteronormativity as this contested social norm, but it's often kind of
I think the stance is more kind of anti-normative as the ideology of queer theory. In queer theory, not queer studies, but anti-normativity, an opposition to norms and normativity in general.
Well, then I think that there's also this
Stemming from
there's also-
heteronormativity, but also
Right.
homonormativity and, yeah.
Any kind of normativity.
And I think there's sometimes two understandings of norms, right? So social norm in the context of Möllers, and I think traditionally in philosophy, is just a rule however vaguely agreed upon, socially guiding human action, right? And even assuming an anti-normative attitude is a normative attitude.
Right.
So you can't escape normativity. Normativity per se, yeah.
But with the critical theory say that the norms we aspire to are always this alternative, a greater future, Enlightenment values, equality, for example, as a norm to strive toward, which we of course fall short from.
Yeah.
Which is separate, and that's sort of, it's normative empirically that we fall short of the norm, but the Enlightenment norm is that we need to value equality, whatever that entails.
Yeah, but that norm itself is always, is always contestable too. Right? Maybe we'll find a
Depending on the
better one.
hermeneutic you're in, right? So queer theory doesn't challenge the normativity of equality, even though they
Right.
like to disrupt it, they're not able to. Right?
Well, I guess
But totally objects to social identity
Yes, but
as
that's
a way of
But that's
getting there.
asocial, when you can't be asocial in a social world.
I do.
I guess my question as a non-queer theory person is, does queer theory, does it really embrace anti-normativity as a whole?
Tries to.
That seems like a paradigm, performative
I don't say
contradiction.
it succeeds.
I don't know who's first, Nina or Kate?
Well, but it can't get away from epistemic normativity,
Yes.
right? So
Right.
epistemic normativity is all about what we need in order to understand and
Right.
truth aptness,
Right.
and you don't want to get away from that because then everything's equally true.
That's, yeah.
Right.
And epistemic normativity is one of the coolest kinds.
I think that's a good question. I don't know if anything specifically treats that question in
And
queer
that's
theory.
where, that would go back to Habermas,
Yeah.
right? And the speech pragmatics.
Right.
You can't argue, so the fact that speech works by and large, you've got these four basic
But only if you
norms.
do proper speech.
He certainly idealizes, yeah.
No, but not only that, but I mean, you have to follow the norms of the, the ideal
Yeah.
speech situation, which are wonderful norms if people could use them.
Yeah. Kate, no one?
To me, when I hear this, and I'm like thinking about hegemony, and especially like the way Laclau talks about hegemony as a way to talk about normativity as being a set of possibilities that each group is trying to contest in the public sphere to establish theirs as the norm, right?
Right.
And when you've succeeded in that, and I think this is where probably queer theory also really has some trouble with this, and this is where we are often in the classroom trying to disrupt and challenge the things that end up being a straitjacket on our thinking because they're such deeply embedded norms that we aren't able to see them, right? And so instead of thinking about just normativity or like counter normativity, you're thinking about hegemony and counter hegemony because that actually makes us look at who's putting together the chains of equivalencies to create the nodal points on which we build our meaning, and then we promptly forget them as soon as they're well established as hegemony. And our challenge is to unveil them as a set of constructions that other people can then come along and contest, right? But that was interesting to me and also very kind of against my initial feelings about normativity, or the ones that I've been building over time, which is to kind of see them so you can deconstruct them.
Yeah.
But I've definitely felt in the classroom lately more of a push to sort of argue for norms in a way that I never have before because of the way that they're being threatened in the current moment. That, yeah.
I think hegemony helps it.
Yeah. But that brings power into question, right?
That's what it is.
Owen?
Okay, well, that was really good. So, as somebody who's very much outside of this, in terms of the philosophy and queer studies, struggling with the definition of anti-normative. So, the way I'm seeing this is we have all of these norms, or like the fact that we have a norm is like just a human perception norm. And so being anti-normative is that, I don't really know what that looks like or what that would be in terms of, like, epistemologically, like we need that kind of a norm, but I don't know if there's an answer to that.
I don't know if that was to me or to
General.
I don't know, it's an open discussion. There are no more discourse.
Yeah, I mean, if you think within queer theory, okay, so we're thinking about sexuality and the gender binary,
Yeah.
is where a lot of this is
Right.
coming from, right? So if you're if you're thinking of heteronormativity specifically, and the understanding that there is a male and a female gender, and they are opposite to each other, then anti-normative would be
That there isn't that.
testing
Yeah.
the existence of a gender binary that are a male and a female that are opposite to each other.
Right.
Right, but now that has become the norm
The
of
norm,
understanding.
exactly.
We
Yeah.
know
Right.
that
So
gender
it
and
doesn't
sexuality is fluid.
Yeah.
Right.
And so now there's nothing there for queer theory to do, and that's why it's in such trouble.
Yes.
That's
where I was going
And
with
so,
this.
from an Enlightenment
Yeah.
perspective, one can argue that same-sex marriage is a great sign of progress because it's in keeping with the Enlightenment's norm of equality, inclusive equality and full participation for all. And yet, from a queer studies point of view, at least some piece of it, it would be seen that it's actually gay's embrace of a heteronormative institution of marriage.
Right.
And
So-
that's where we come into homonormativity.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
Where you have the same-sex couple and the
Yeah.
black lab and the Subaru and the.
I would say that anti-normativity always looks for thinking how norms can be oppressive to any kind of experience, you know?
But they can also
For
be.
example, this binary
Right,
male
right.
and female also can be oppressive to identities that are not, or don't want to assume those roles, right?
Right.
So if there are norms that are oppressing or are excluding or are negating or are negating other experiences to build itself, there is this need of critique. That's what queer
Yeah.
theories go to.
You know, those are particular norms that are always up for challenge, right? But normativity per se can't quite avoid.
That's why it's also difficult to call queer theory.
Yeah.
And queer studies also
Yeah.
could be more an approach to be critical when a norm is
Right.
or can be oppressive. Because, for example, this paradigm from a German perspective can be totally weird and strange to an indigenous in the Amazon.
Right,
You know?
right.
And central to that project are these epistemic norms, right? That one of the biggest problems with that kind of normativity is that we're blind to what we're blind to,
Right.
right? And that's an epistemic problem that we need epistemic norms to counter.
But you think that you're reproducing the binary, if I may boldly say, by talking about afactuality, because it's giving the anchor to fact, as if facts are all, and therefore, you know.
I hope it ties to facts, right? I don't want to ignore facts. Facts are great, right? But
Right.
I hope that the afactual.
Counter ethics or something.
I think the afactual captures more than just ethics.
Yeah.
Clara and Donna, maybe last two?
I have a question in terms of what you have brilliantly exposed and the act of reading.
The act of
Reading,
reading.
and specifically reading social media. There used to be a time when we were reading a book, a newspaper, and those were coming from authority figures. And we were all in consensus that those were authoritative voices that could speak on the matters they were writing about. With the advent of social media and the imperfect promise of Bill Gates when he promised to put information at our fingertips, should have been the right information at our fingertips. Now we have a different mode of reading in which we are reading a news that is on a different medium, meaning the computer, the laptop, the tablets, and so forth. But also we have a comment section. And we have a confluence of many norms. We have a confluence of many facts. And we also have to add the fact that we don't have the certainty of the authority of whoever is writing and originating the news. And therefore you can start labeling fake, true, smart news. How would you apply this knowledge to that type of scenario?
I think that's kind of our jobs here, you know, but not just here. This should happen in
Yes,
elementary school,
yes,
middle school, and high
uh-huh.
school. We shouldn't be making up for lost, things missed in high school. But good reading skills. I think there is better and worse reading. I think there are better and worse opinions, and you can evaluate that content. Right? I think that's a contentious claim to say that that some people would have issues with saying that there are better and worse opinions. But yeah, slow reading, right? I've come to read less in class, but try to read it well. Coming right out of grad school, we're gonna read 200 pages a week, right? I think we've gone back to 60-ish now a week. Try to keep it at that. Yeah, so reading well, I think, is not just reading, but reading well. I mean, it's really discouraging to see social media patterns, but I also take a little hope in the fact that this happened with the printing press too. Right? There was a flood of information, there's a revolution in technology, and it overwhelms a lot of people. And I'm hoping that just some common sense will ultimately prevail, some dialectic development.
Oh, and also I had one suggestion for your chart. When it was talked about putting it into motion, when I saw it, it reminded me of an island, and then you have the sea. And then the overlapping area would be the waves that are in constant flux, and then the high seas would be the, I would just suggest that.
Are you trying to make a connection with the Puerto Rico lab? If so, I applaud that. Spring break is over. Spring break is over.
So my
Donna, last
question
one?
is in fact a segue. Is virtual media afactual?
I mean, the data that's, I mean, the text that's there is empirical, right?
Yeah.
But
So that's a fact. But the reality is afactual,
well,
right?
it's narratives and opinions that are just thrown out there, and those all have to be evaluated in their own right. I mean, social media as a phenomenon is an empirical fact, right?
So, the BBC did a fantastic, this is sort of getting at that, the BBC did a fantastic piece about the original troll who started, like this is a number of years ago, so 2015 in reference to the most recent election, online trolling. And so basically these alt-right web pages, so white supremacy, fascism, like neo-Nazi, like all of these different groups, and spewing out absolutely ridiculous things like Obama has 3 affairs and This guy lives in Maine and is a far left Democrat. Okay? Yeah. So
is he in driving distance?
Listen to this. That was my opinion. Yeah, he is, and that's. I almost was like, we're going over there. He lives like an hour from here. And you hear that, and you go, what the hell? And he, in his mind, was saying, wow, this is hilarious. It is so afactual. Like, there's no, like, there's just no truth to it. And it turns out that he ended up in a positive relationship with a fact checker from Sweden who would then follow all of his articles and follow up and say, this is factually incorrect. But creating this social sphere where the alt-right, and I'm just going to lump everything together there, is shown to be ridiculous, follow anything, post-truth, or not really afactual, but these ideas that are just opinions that are not based in anything. And so there's a lot more to that article, but like I think that's very relevant to social media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I close with a comment about norms that I appreciate, and I don't know if this is a norm in philosophy discussions, but I appreciate that you took up less than half of the time with your actual talk. Having this robust conversation instead of leaving 5 minutes for questions at the end. And
it was one of the most intellectually stimulating conversations I've been in for a while.
Seriously. Thanks for coming.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Please, for cookies before.